Welcome to week 2 of UBD, and wanted to start out this week by sharing the sample unit or the simple stages for the unit template that you'll be using to complete an assignment for this week. So this here it tells us kind of what we want you to be thinking about, and I'll make reference to it in the presentation as well. But you want to have your unit topic, your subjects, your grade, your time frame, those kind of things. And this is really just kind of a real rough outline of what you're thinking about doing for your final project. So it doesn't have to be polished. It doesn't have to be, the final product. This is a working document that we can work through, giving feedback and things back and forth, and to do that. And so you'll complete this, and then on UIU Learn, you'll turn it in on the assignments page, and I'll give you some feedback on those. They aren't due until later in the week. If you want to check the syllabus and check out the due dates, that'll let you know. So I just want to start tonight by showing you those, and then we'll get talking here through the PowerPoint, and I'll be referring back to this template, as so to speak, as we go through, and you can go ahead and be thinking about what are some things maybe you want to put in there, especially in terms of when we start talking about essential questions, learning targets. Those don't necessarily have to be written in this piece, but that's something you want to start thinking about when you're planning, because that really drives what you're going to use, as well as what learning targets you want based on what standard you're teaching in that specific content. So this is just like I said, this is the template. It's on UIU Learn to download. You should be able to type in, then it turns into a Word document, and then towards the end of the week you'll need to resubmit this to get some feedback, which will really kind of help us moving towards that rough draft of stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, and ultimately your final, which is the kind of polished version of this draft. So the first things you want to think about when you're sketching out that unit, as we described, or I just described on the template, here's some things to kind of guide your early thinking. And as I said, this is a real rough draft of what you're thinking and where you're at and what you want to be doing. But in stage 1, you want to think about what are those desired long-term and short-term goals of your unit. So it might be something that's scaffolded. It might be something that's an overarching idea like writing, sentence structure, that kind of thing. It might be something that's very short-term and specific, and you probably need to include both in those, and that really helps guide that. That's where those learning targets come in, the essential questions, those kind of things. The second stage is really what's the evidence you're looking for that can produce a result that tells you your students are learning and achieving those goals, and ultimately that's those standards at the end. And again, these assessments don't have to always be paper and pencil. They can be project-based. They can be authentic tasks. They can be competency-based things with the computer. They can be paper and pencil. It all depends on what your teaching style is and what the expectations are in your classroom. And then ultimately the third stage here is you're looking at what's the most appropriate learning events for achieving those goals. So it starts with this kind of overarching umbrella of here's what I'm hoping to accomplish. Then it gets a little more specific with these are the evidences I need. And then it gets really specific with saying these are the specific ways I'm teaching the learning events. That would be where on a lesson plan you might be looking at your acquiring new knowledge, parts of those. That part really comes here is what are we doing? What's the actual teaching look like? What's the strategy you're using? And so I just showed you the sample, the template. There is a sample in your textbook, figure deep 1, and that it's got a shows you kind of how to fill that in and what are some of the things you want to think about. So these are some overarching questions now that really will drive kind of getting your mind wrapped around creating a unit. And a lot of us are already doing that, already creating units for higher ed, preschool, and everything in between. And so you want to think, what are your initial thoughts? So what have I been doing if it's an old unit, or what would I like to do if it's a new unit? And then what are the topics within that? And that's one of the things about being a teacher that's really important, is to be a reflective teacher and to be able to take those things and apply them and say, well, that really didn't work so well. What can I do to change that? And this gives you a great opportunity to start over with something old that you like, but you're wanting to give more specificity to it. It might give you a chance to say, you know what, I really think this would be a good area to teach, and it's tying into the standards. This is what the unit is I should be developing. All right, so then in the desired results, what, if any, standards are relevant? And there should always be standards that are relevant to what you're teaching. Standards are what drive our instruction, especially here in the state of Iowa. You think about something that's nationwide like the core. Those sort of standards are things that should be driving what we're doing. It's the expectation um, of educators to teach those, as well as those are the sort of things that are assessed on both the Iowa assessments or standardized tests within your state and the national level, like the SAT and the ACT. Um, and it really is just kind of varies as to how closely they're related, if they tie very specifically to that, or if it's just a loose knowledge base. So, how do you find out standards? That's a good question. And if you're someone who's working in science or social studies, there are new standards coming out. They've been adopted by the state here in the state of Iowa. They're being pushed out. There's plenty of trainings as well as looking online, Googling those kind of things. And if you're here in the state of Iowa, you're teaching the state of Iowa, the Iowa Core, there's a way to find all of those standards that are being taught. If you're someone who's outside of the state of Iowa and you're teaching in Louisiana or Illinois or Missouri, you can find their state standards. And if they don't have state standards, what are the national standards in the Common Core that they're looking at? And again, like I said, a lot of states have adopted things like the NGSS, which is Next Generation Science Standards, and those sort of things. And you can find them. They're pretty easy to find. If you can't, please let me know and I'll get you pointed in the right direction. And these standards often identify content and skills that are needed. However, they don't tell you how to teach it. They don't tell you how to assess it. And in a lot of cases, they're very broad goals. For example, social studies went from having something like 13 goals for everyone to now having in the neighborhood of between 20 and 25 goals for each grade level, including things like financial literacy, writing literacy, Iowa history, those sort of things. So you really want to see which standards are working to you. You want to make sure that the priority standards are being taught. And then if there are other standards that you would like to associate with that, that's where you tie that in. And then the other part of it is they don't tell you how to have your students do these things. And so it's the idea of, as the teacher, we still have enough autonomy in our profession that we're able to pick and choose how we want to do that. So you have this standard that's driving your instruction, but beyond that, it's up to individual school districts, individual teachers, individual counties or parishes, or however that's being handled. And oftentimes, there's not a specific pattern to follow. There's not a specific blueprint. That falls on the teacher. And so it's really important to examine these questions when you're doing that. So you definitely want to identify the point of your unit. And how might that identifying the point help you identify your results? And that's the point of UBD. So what do I want my unit to be about? How does it relate to my standards? And then how do I create an assessment that drives my instruction? And that's what was discussed this week in Module D and E. And then with the template, this is where you really want to start thinking about what fits into those. What are my identifications? What are the points I'm trying to make? What are the standards that are aligning? Those sort of things. And then when you're talking about assessment, which is there's entire classes taught on assessment at the university level. But when you think about it as a teacher or someone working in higher education, what is the evidence that's showing that students are understanding, or the people that you're working with are understanding and meeting those goals or those knowledge claims that you need them to do? And that's important to identify. What evidence are you using? So for an example, I just finished teaching a unit on Ellis Island, and we did a simulation. We did a pre-test. We did some independent learning. We did some teacher-driven instruction. The students participated in a simulation where they took on the role of a immigrant. And then we did a little bit more of the teacher-driven instruction, and we did a post-test. So those were the things so the evidence for me would be observation. It would be the formative assessment, right, within those, the reflection piece and those kind of things. It was also the informal, right, formative assessment, watching students and seeing where they're at, thumbs up, thumbs down, those kind of things, as well as the summative assessment, because Ellis Island and the standards that were related to Ellis Island might only be a small portion of what's being taught in that class. And so my evidence is where all of those different things tied together. And the reason to do that is to understand that students don't always do everything well. And so you want to make sure you can assess them in a way that shows you their understanding. And then you also need to make sure that there's evidence of knowledge and skills, as well as evidence of understanding. And we talked last week about knowledge versus understanding. Knowledge is the lower level on Bloom's taxonomy. It's that identify sort of thing. And then understanding is where you get into the deeper level. So things like create, analyze, synthesize. You have to have both types of evidence. Otherwise, you're only looking at a surface level of understanding or knowledge, and you're not meeting the points that you should be. Another important part of evidence and assessment is depth and breadth of the goals of your unit. And so, as a social studies teacher or a history teacher, we always say that history, you could go a mile long and an inch deep, or you can go a mile deep and an inch wide. And so the idea is, what level do you want to teach that content? And that's driven by your assessment, and it's driven by the standards that you're choosing. And so, as we said before, that evidence has to assess understanding and application. What are the students understanding, and how is it being applied? So with that will really help you kind of complete stage 2 of your initial sketch. And those sort of things are really what you want to be thinking about in terms of planning backwards as well. So then you look at stage 3, and what are some of the learning activities? Those could be things, as broad as saying something like a KWL chart, a pair share, think pair share, a read, discuss, and write. Whatever your strategy is that you're using, that's where this will go in. And it can be fairly broad here at the beginning, but as you get into that unit, you want to think about what's the day-to-day delivery method in terms of how you're getting information to your students. And it's important to use a variety of those. The drill and kill doesn't always work. The student-led instruction where you throw out a question and they go and do it on their own, that doesn't always work either. There's this nice mix that needs to develop as you go through your stage 3. All right, and so last week we talked again about the 4 types of goals, and so I'm just going to go through these pretty quickly, but it's knowledge, skill, meaning, and transfer. And as we know, what's the knowledge? What's the skill the student needs to acquire? What's the meaning behind what they're learning? And then can they transfer it to something else? So as you're thinking about that with the template, you probably want to go ahead and write down some of these. What does the description of this goal look like in my classroom? A special ed classroom or a preschool classroom, or even not in a classroom, but when you're working with teachers, or when you're working with administrators, or you're working with people at the college level. And then, you don't have to share these with a partner or anything like that, but it would be a good idea to maybe think about where this is going and talk to people in your building, talk to people in your your cohort. If you're working with some people here, it's always good to bounce ideas off of people, but that definitely you don't need to do anything formal, just to kind of think and share those out. Okay, so we went through this last time. So knowledge is just declarative knowledge. Skills, procedural knowledge, can you do what's expected? Meaning, students make connections and explain things in their own words. And if you're familiar with SRG or SBG, this is very similar to that in terms of how that's being applied. It also meets Bloom's taxonomy in terms of transfer. Can students independently learn it and add it to a new context? And so those of you that are doing SBG or SPG, I'm not sure how you're going about that. If your 4 is a thorough understanding, or if your 4 is an exceeds mastery, but that transfer piece is what we've really been talking a lot about in our district and with other districts about. Is that thorough understanding, the ability to go out and apply that in a new and novel setting? And that used to be the word transference in education.